worst album ever. Knocked Out Loaded, 1986. If you ask any given Bob fan what they think the worst Bob Dylan album is, and the odds are you won't get the answer you expect. Ask any 2, 5, 8, and you'll probably get 2, 5 or 8 different answers. Ask 100 and you may have some sort of consensus, but I bet it won't be this one, because not enough people will readily remember it to name it. When people say something like, oh, worst album, that's Down in the Groove. And you'll say, well, what about Knocked Out Loaded? And they'll stop and they'll think and they'll go, oh yeah, that one. Faceless, gormless, and with the sole exception of Brownsville Girl and perhaps an energetic go at Junior Parker's You Wanna Ramble, very un-Bob-like. I suspect this is the point where Bob realised he spent the last 5 years making bad to nondescript music, wearing a leather vest, sleeveless t-shirt and a preposterous earring, and he decided by whatever means possible after this to strip his music back to some kind of relatable truth going forward. Christmas in the Heart, 2009. Bad joke. Really. Ho ho ho. I know some people who like this, but to me it seems to be a good idea all too po-facedly executed. At least the money it made went to charity. Self-Portrait, 1970. So far it's all pretty much going to script. One would have thought 50 years down the track that this aimless, tuneless, spineless, tedious work would have become in some way fashionable. It has, to an extent, via the agency of the Bootleg series, which highlighted the deliberate perversity with which Dylan evidently loaded the album with subpar material. As he said to Bob Shelton, if you're going to put a lot of crap on it, you may as well load it up. It did have one significant defender, Mark Bolan, who wrote an impassioned plea of its case to Melody Maker in 1970, but seeing he was a hippie at the time as opposed to a fully fledged glam rock god, he was roundly and rightly ignored. Saved, 1980. Saved is an album of good songs that could, treated properly, have been the near equal of Slow Train Coming. I mean, good songs relative to what they were. They made no pretense to universality of truth and experience that may have been afforded by some of his other songs, but as additions to a broader Bob gospel canon, they could have been very important. The problem lay in having heard his road band work through the songs on the fantastic shows of the 1979-80 gospel tour. Bob thought he could take a tired and slightly over it band and get lightning in a bottle at the end of the tour, but what he got were tired and slightly over it performances, and the lack of an audience for him to combat with and convert left his performance sounding more like self-parody. So an album with such a passionate genesis wound up being quickly tossed off by his progenitor, who, smelling money to be made on the European circuit, cut the sleeves off his t-shirt, donned a leather vest and a preposterous earring, and went back to singing the oldies. Down in the Groove, 1988. Another record frequently cited as Dylan's worst. It's only redeemed from that spot in the eyes of this humble reviewer by a few lively, spiky numbers that distract from the stupid Had a Dream About You Baby and soporific Death Is Not the End. Two more thoughtful songs, a cover of Hank Snow's 90 Miles an Hour and the old Okie gospel song Rank Strangers to Me, equally pass muster. It's not his worst to my ears, but probably his most pointless record, given it was culled from half a dozen sessions over 4 years, lacking accordingly either a musical or even a philosophical centre. Under the Red Sky, 1991. A huge step back from the wonderful Oh Mercy. Under the Red Sky resembles no less than the woe-begotten Down in the Groove, inasmuch as for every interesting song here, Unbelievable, God Knows, Handy Dandy, the title track with its unmistakable George Harrison guitar solo, there is one of the most hack, lazy and downright ridiculous songs he's ever written, and a few more to spare. Add to that a slicked on Wass production and too many guest stars, and the record just doesn't really need them, and we've got a record that in and of itself just isn't necessary. Empire Burlesque from 1985. 8 dull, uninspired songs sandwiched between one interesting one, Tight Connection to My Heart, and one faintly great one, the exceptional closer Dark Eyes. Fairy dusted to death with glossy 80s production, Empire Burlesque is Bob at his most lost, least engaged, most redundant and frankly dullest. When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky is a worthy song stretched to an interminable plod of over-emoted lyrics, jarringly edited in synths that make a lot of noise and never say anything, and cheese-grater guitars. The bootleg series version, recorded shortly before, would have raised the album immeasurably, and the same can be said for Tight Connection to My Heart. Someone's Gotten Hold of My Heart is much better. There's been some broad and largely slightly more favourable critical revision of opinion on this album by the community of Dylanistas. Indeed, 20 years ago this would have been bottom of the heap for me, but for me, and for most, it'll never be much better than I've put it here. It is what it is, and it isn't very good. Infidels from 1983. A problematic case. Two world-class Bob Dylan songs, I and Joker Man. Two, maybe three so-so tracks, Man of Peace and Sweetheart Like You. Don't Fall Apart on Me Tonight flirts with the ridiculous but manages to stay just about upright. And three of the inarguably worst songs he ever wrote. Neighbourhood Bully, License to Kill and the spectacularly stupid Union Sundown. Conventional wisdom has this as a step up from Shot of Love, but I can't see it that way. Shot of Love gave the impression of sincere, straightforward songs, direct in language and the situations they described, whereas Infidels is verbose and obscure and worst of all full of forced sounding politics, smack of an attempt to become once again hip and relevant. The previously mentioned egregious three are the primary offenders. Like the following Empire Burlesque though, the album is overshadowed by what we did not know at the time. That left off the album were two masterpieces, the surly, malevolent Foot of Pride and the magnificent Blind Willie McTell, one of the finest songs Bob's ever crafted. And an album with those two songs replacing the three stinkers is an altogether different proposition. It also vexes one to know that whatever promise and goodwill Infidels built up, the subsequent underwhelming live album, Real Live, and Empire Burlesque would immediately squander. Fallen Angels, 2016. The Standards trilogy of 2015 to 17 warrants its own discussion. In truth, 5 albums including a vast triple disc in which Dylan mines each to similar levels of reward, the pop music of the late 30s to early 60s. Fallen Angel gets a bad rap, but for me it's merely due to the chaff to wheat ratio compared to the preceding Shadows in the Night. This being the leftovers disc from those sessions that sees this one sit lower. Polka Dots and Moonbeams, for example, is the subject of considerable opprobrium amongst fans, but I like it. Wonky pitching and all or nothing at all, a song which is inextricably interwoven with the legend of Frank Sinatra, gets an appropriately royal treatment. Melancholy Mood is suitably sombre, and Skylark is, as Hoagie Carmichael should always be, taken at sufficient nobility. The big problem, and the clear reason this material was not considered for Shadows in the Night, is that Dylan tends to be more static, even reverential on these songs, and there's a sense that on a few of them he's still trying to feel his way into the material. It's never quite clear where Dylan's head is at on the Standards trilogy, but wherever it was, Fallen Angels can't help but feel like an attractive afterthought. Tempest, 2012, and here's where it starts to get sticky. Released as it was to great acclaim in 2012, but then Dylan was pretty much critically untouchable at that point, consisting of what Robert Christgau called an auto-hype machine, Tempest sees Dylan in bloody myth-making mode. When he's good, Duquesne Whistle, where the bloody is left in the making of the video, Early Roman Kings, Pay and Blood, etc., he leaves a Johnny Cash topping body count, but little lingers afterwards, and at its worst, the somnambulance Soon After Midnight, which appears way too early in the sequence, and the closing triptych, Tin Angel and Tempest, which over the course of their collective 22 minutes seems to be setting up a killer blow, only to swing and miss with the flaccid roll-on John to conclude. The almost omnipresent wheeze of accordion and Bob's descending to Cookie Monster Wolfman voice doesn't help matters here in the slightest either. 2020's Rough and Rowdy Ways was an album which caused brief at-the-mouth foaming, but as usual, once people actually listened to the record, they calmed down somewhat. A mind-numbing double disc of over-wordy mumbling, you can see what Bob is trying to do. He's still trying to find a way to make the torch he's trying to hand over, that of traditional folk ballad and old songs and new again tradition, a new folk music if you like. He's trying to make that more acceptable and enticing for people to pick up and take on, rather than simply imitate the same steps Bob himself took to get there. But the songs are only occasionally exciting, the narratives hop and jump around a bit too much, and while it occasionally threatens an impertinent pun or thought-provoking diversion, it's hard to see what actual purpose the song Murder Most Foul serves. The one thing it gets right is its title, channeling as it does Jimmy Rogers, but it is neither rough nor rowdy enough to interest anyone but those who still see Bob for what he was in 1965. The soundtrack to Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid is a far from bad album, and while I never need to hear another cover version of Knocking on Heaven's Door again, it has some compelling songs on it. What it also has is a lot of pleasant but aimless guitar noodling which serve as the themes and cues for the music. It's a complete outlier in his catalogue, and I can easily imagine it having some very passionate fans and defenders, but your average punter looking to dip their toes into Dylan should look at this as a reward album, not as a cornerstone piece. Shadows in the Night was Dylan's first foray into the world of Frank Sinatra, which was also about the heretofore discussed Fallen Angels and the henceforth discussed Triplicate. If the album was meant to shock anyone, it didn't, apart from the revival of Dylan's voice along with the simple but sympathetic backing from his band. But really, an all-oldies album was long on the cards, even if the exclusive focus on Il Patrone was surprising. There are some very good moments. The Night We Called It a Day, Why Try to Change Me Now, I'm a Fool to Want You, while technically a Sinatra song, it's inevitably drawn against Billie Holiday's version on Lady in Satin, and a surprisingly wonderful resurrection of his concert standard, That Lucky Old Sun. It's a diversion and not a bad one. Its world-weary tones superior to the inconsistent Fallen Angel, but they don't provide as strange a ride as Triplicate. Back in 2006, it was hard to wade through the great wave of adulation that accompanied the release of Modern Times. I've always considered it to be an Emperor's New Clothes album, like Tempest and I'll Tell All Your Why. Firstly, there's the sound of it. Bobheads, have you ever heard a record by Bob sound so inorganic and sterile? Between the swinging, funky Love and Theft and the straight-ahead Chicago sound of Together Through Life, this isn't even vanilla, it's Ned Flanders unflavoured ice cream. There are some excellent songs which we'll come to, but there are some that miss the mark, principally because they linger too long on Dylan's road-worn and decaying voice, and there's the nasty stain of plagiarism all over the album, which Dylan seems to get a pass on because, well, he's Dylan. Not only does he get a pass, he actually gets a Nobel Prize for it. Thunder on the Mountain sets the scene effectively, portraying some kind of war between heaven and earth, but it doesn't go anywhere, and Spirit on the Water lingers far too long for both the tune that holds it and Dylan's croaks to sustain it. The next three songs, Rollin' and Tumblin', When the Deal Goes Down and Someday Baby, are all barefaced steals. Working Man Blues number 2 is a good song that sees Dylan finding his voice and a lyrical purpose. Beyond the Horizon and The Levee's Gonna Break, again a pretty straightforward lift. The latter from Memphis Minnie, from whom he has stolen before. While Nettie Moore is fine and ain't talking, even if it does contain some minor pinches from the Stanley Brothers, is very good indeed. Perhaps this record belongs with the previous, where the bad outweighs the good, but I'll give old Bob the benefit of the doubt and suggest that this was an album built around a concept that didn't work. The idea of presenting a collection of appraisals and remodelings of older song forms, a self-written Good As I've Been to You if you like. It's a shame no one seriously tried to go forward with it, and those who did take up the torch were just happy to bathe in the limelight by association. In Bob's line of work, and in the music he makes, growing old isn't a crime. In fact, not growing old is. That's the chief problem with our next album, the topical song-oriented The Times They Are a-Changin'. Stark, monotonous, and all but devoid of the variety and spark that drove his previous album, Times can be a bit of a slog. The title track is a sanctimonious and calculated attempt to write, as he told Tony Glover, something that people seem to like to hear. Only a pawn in their game gives the impression of being made up as it goes along. Hollis Brown is a literal dirge, and the best of the protest songs in Hattie Carroll rises to the occasion because Dylan is invested in it, writing it as he did on the way home from attending Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and is rather grand for it. It's the other 5 songs of surprise and delight. One Too Many Mornings, a sweet and reflective love song. North Country Blues, which says more in half the time with half the pathos that Hollis Brown does. A Rollicking When the Ship Comes In, which is an outlier on the album simply because it's such great fun. And 2 truly remarkable songs at the end. The warm, unpretentious and sincere Boots of Spanish Leather, his perhaps unwitting farewell note to Susie Rotolo, and Restless Farewell, a worldly fare thee well not only to the Allies no longer useful, but the folk scene in general. Compare and contrast with positively 4th Street. What then is the flaw, the fatal mar in this album? Simply that for the times they are a-changing, the times did indeed change and left this album somewhat behind. Much like modern times, Dylan's attempt to further and to expand the folk tradition brought about only imitation but not innovation of spirit. Far from a bad album and a song or two short of a superior one, it does have to live with the ill distinction of being the weakest album of the 60s by the man who perhaps defined the 1960s. From the dreadfully earnest to the sublimely indifferent, we move almost 60 years ahead to Triplicate, an album which on the surface seems dreadfully unpromising. From its seemingly ill-fitting title and lazy cover to the sheer weight of the track list, which again visits a great American songbook from a Sinatra-skewed lens, the initial impression is one of excess and pointlessness. But pointless is the last thing this collection is. Over 3 supposedly thematically organised discs, Dylan examines the true art of American pop song, departing a number of them from our concreted-in preconceptions of them and showing to be every bit as much a part of the new folk tradition he wants his legacy to be part of. And I may be being a little over-fanciful here. Were the discs arranged 2, 3, 1, you'd have a loose concept album on the conceits of masculinity. Thinking about that, Bob's catalogue is defined by 3s. 3 folky albums at the beginning, 3 era-defining rock albums, 3 albums dedicated to deconstructing that definition of the rock album, 3 modern singer-songwriters, 3 religious albums, 3 to get to grips with the 80s, 3 big comeback Americana albums, and 3 great American songbook records. There's also the irresistible comparison to the way the album is presented, much like the original idea of an album being a book to store records by an artist in. Triplicate is considerably more lively in parts than the crepuscular shadows in the night and the uncertain fallen angels, with songs like I Guess I'll Have to Change My Plan, Braggin', which is a real gem, Day In, Day Out, These Foolish Things and A Joyful The Best Is Yet to Come, having genuine energy. There are plenty of other good takes too, Trade Winds, Sentimental Journey, and wonderful versions of It's Funny to Anyone But Me, I Could Have Told You, and especially Why Was I Born. But it isn't all gravy. There are dull and unnecessarily seeming takes on Stormy Weather and As Time Goes By, I Couldn't Sleep a Wink Last Night, and When the World Was Young, and There's a Flaw in My Flu, which was an afterthought when Sinatra recorded it, and it remains so with Bob. The rest is not unpleasant, but inessential, much like all of the filler on the albums in this section. A case of the classic triple album that could have made a great single album. But Triplicate does close the American songbook period for now on a satisfying note. So was it all worth it? The songbook trilogy would have sat better in the grand scheme of things had the albums either side of it been better. Had he left us with a masterpiece instead of Tempest and come back convincingly instead of an exercise in being what people expect him to be. But given he didn't, it looks from a distance like an expensive time-buying exercise from Dylan, which brought limited results in rough and rowdy ways. But if the Dylan we now have is the Dylan we must have, then at least the trilogy gave us one last chance to hear his voice in a new light and revel in his ability to use his life and his experience to uncover, rather than cover, some of the greatest musical statements ever made. Of course, while the trilogy might have been our last chance to see Dylan address the music that in part made him, it wasn't the first. 1992's Good As I've Been to You not too reverently returned to Scotch-Irish folk tradition with a mix of Mississippi blues and proto-rock and roll tossed in. Some may see this as an attempt to cash in on the first instalment of the Bootleg series, but on the whole the folk songs here are better than the ones on Bootleg Volume 1. The well-known songs Frankie and Albert, Tomorrow Night, Blackjack Davy, Step It Up and Go, Sitting on Top of the World and Froggy Went A-Courtin' serve to open up the record for the lesser-known songs, which are all equally charming. It's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but it is mine, some slight failings of Bob's voice notwithstanding. So why isn't it with its bookend album World Gone Wrong? Simple. Good as it is, Good As I've Been to You isn't as good as World Gone Wrong. Nowhere near it. There's no shame in that. It's like saying that Cristiano Ronaldo isn't nearly as good as Lionel Messi. It's good on its own terms, but just not as good as it is on someone else's terms. Dylan is a famous artist, but he has never been, in truth, an especially popular one. There's a story, and I don't know how true it is, that his biggest selling studio album, which is currently Blood on the Tracks, has sold fewer copies than AC/DC's worst selling album. His cult, however, is rabid and diverse, and few albums have as devoted a subcult as 1978's Street Legal, an album with a bitter core and a certain hollowness, even deceitfulness, in its most lauded songs. It's the songs, though, that not the performances, that flatter to deceive. The playing is frequently inspired, and Dylan is in extraordinary voice. Sporting a one-of-a-kind sound, large ensemble complete with backing vocalists, prior to its remastering in 1999, the album suffered from a dense, foggy sound and interminable bleed from one instrument into another's microphone, which added to the mystery. This is because it was recorded in a rehearsal space and not a studio. I assume post-divorce, money suddenly was an object. Bob and Sarah's bitter divorce is one of the dividing lines that runs through the songs on the album. Dylan frequently chooses to portray himself as the victim of some inflexible appendage of fate, victim to both his destiny and the vicissitudes of fortune that surrounded him. This takes up most of the album. The crackling, sly new pony, No Time to Think, which is, despite a camouflage of verbiage, a remarkably straightforward telling of descent and fall. True Love Tends to Forget, however, pushes the blame on Sarah's for her being unable to forget or forgive and for punishing Dylan by leaving him in limbo. Finally, we have We Better Talk This Over, a nasty song where Dylan paints he and Sarah as equal culprits, but only ends up sounding like he's equivocating. But there's an odious whiff of hubris and moral midgetry about the song. Baby Stop Crying and Is Your Love in Vain are mean-spirited, inferior songs. Baby Stop Crying, festooned in cliche, paints Sarah as the wrongdoer in all this, while Is Your Love in Vain hardly presents Bob as the catch of the century. Which brings us to what a lot of people see as the nub of the album, the three mystery songs. Changing of the Guards, Signor, Tales of Yankee Power, and Where Are You Tonight, Journey Through the Dark Heat. At the risk of expressing an unpopular opinion, while a lot of people, including me at one point, see these songs as a prelude to Dylan's conversion to Christianity, I no longer think they are. I think that what both disinterested listeners and those who have a stake, however vicarious, in Bob's Christian experience have in common is a kind of literary pareidolia, a tendency to see patterns and derive meanings in unrelated information sets. Besides, the dates just don't line up properly. Dylan drafted these songs on his Minnesota ranch in the winter of 1977-78, recorded them in the last week of April 1978 and released them in October. Dylan first sang the songs live in June or very early July 1978. The notorious Tucson motel room encounter with Jesus took place in November. So what are they about? Signor, much praised for its sinewy arrangement and menacing vocal, bewilders me. Again, its biblical images, Armageddon, overturning tables, an iron cross, evoke all manner of logical stretches from Bob was, is, always will be a Christian cadre, but its mysterious strangers, muddled narratives of Bob's myth-making as he introduced the song on stage in 1978, all confuse and contradict each other. It's a little movie and a song, a murder mystery on the border, a distant cousin of Just Like Tom Thumb's Blues. It's Bob flexing his power to evoke but lacking the commitment to make an actual connection. It's one of the surreal narratives from Desire taken to its illogical conclusion. Where it does succeed, though, is musically, being the only song on the album that the production and arrangement lets any air into, which makes a welcome change from the murky and opaque sound of the songs around it. Changing of the Guards, probably the most popular song in the collection, is the most problematic song on the album. Its issues arise not out of any action of Dylan's, however, but of people's seemingly endless desire to be fooled by him, whether he intends to fool us or not. To me, and I would love correction or advice on this opinion, changing of the guards doesn't especially mean anything unless you want it to mean something, in which case it means what you want it to mean. Period it sideways in shadow or fog or half woken from a dream. Squint your eyes and make the song about what you think it is. Medieval romance, presage to the Great Conversion, metaphorical recounting of Dylan's career as a musician, or just a mental diversion to mystify and amuse. We'll likely never know because in all truth I've never seen any evidence that Bob himself knows. A man who sneers at the depredations of deconstructionists has pre-deconstructed his own work. Where Are You Tonight is possibly a mythic retelling of his relationship with Sarah, focusing on the good times, laughter down on Elizabeth Street, and the bad, especially Sarah's attempt to take the children away from California. There's a babe in the arms of a woman in a rage. It's clear he misses Sarah dreadfully, and there is a glimmer of self-knowing in the song the other songs lack, when he sings, "I fought with my twin, that enemy within, till both of us fell by the way. Horseplay and disease is killing me by degrees." But there are too many reams of pretty posy that are impenetrable to an outside audience which don't advance the song. Something Leonard Cohen understood, and why he should have got the Nobel Prize. Well, for that and for Beautiful Losers. Despite, or more likely because of, its mix of grumpy misery and general inscrutability, American critics panned the album. But in the UK, it's still his biggest selling studio album, at a miserly 370,000 copies.